dear friend, and we worked on this conference together. And that's when I first met Timothy Leary. Now, I should say that maybe when I first met Tim, I was not impressed with him at all. I was very surprised that he had been a Harvard professor, but Harvard still had a lot of prestige in my mind. I knew about him through the media when I was a kid. He was very famous, and he seemed like a sort of just a character, not really a significant person, urging people to turn on, tune in, drop out. I didn't really follow that when I was 12 or 13 years old, and he was fired from Harvard, so that must have been something terrible, I thought. And then he advocated people take LSD, and I thought that LSD made you crazy. I still think that it does, actually, and I may return to that. But anyway, my first impressions of Tim were that he was not a particularly admirable guy. And then when I met him, I felt kind of the same way. He was very, kind of fidgety, and kind of went off. He seemed kind of, neurotic, and I didn't. And I remember telling that to Frank, like, I'm very surprised that he was such a great leader, writer, professor. He seemed like to wander all over the place, and I wasn't really very much aware at that time that Tim had only recently been let out of prison, where he had spent a total of, I think, 5 years in and out of prisons, and he was subjected to some possibly inhumane treatments in his last time in prison, and he carried a lot of stress. I wasn't really appreciative of that at the time. But I had him filed away in a category of my mind that if we were going to resurrect this subject of psychedelic drugs, we'd have to, steer clear of Tim, because the spin that he put on them was disruptive, and so I won't associate with him very much. I'm critical of what he did, and that was pretty much my feeling. This was 1981 when I first met him. And pretty much how I felt up until I would see him periodically, and he was still kind of an advisor to me. I knew I would go visit him when he would come up and visit Frank. I would get together with them, but it was one of the most important parts of his message in the 1960s was turn on, tune in, drop out. Now, he meant that he's trying to get across the very important point that I feel very strongly about today, is that the media in the United States, now you know this already because you grew up in a totalitarian country that everybody knew was a totalitarian country, but here people think that we have a democratic country and that we have something called a free press. Well, this is not true in America. We don't have a free press. Our press is also controlled by forces loyal to the military-industrial complex and to the banking system, and especially, as I said, to the war machine. And it's not a free press that informs you. It's a propaganda ministry that is part of a mind control way to control opinions and consciousness in America. And not only the media, but the university system is also really designed to impart a worldview and a perspective, not truly to educate people, but to make them subservient to this ideology of advanced corporate capitalism. And so the media and the government and the educational system they're not your friends. And so when Tim is saying turn on, he means wake up to this. Tune into other dimensions of reality that can inform you, your own soul, your own spirit, nature, other people. He did research in psychology to show. So when he said turn on, tune in, drop out, he was meaning specifically to this socially constructed reality of modern society that was also, at the time embroiled in the Vietnam War, and so. But my first decade of study in the field of psychedelics. I wasn't a dropout. In fact, I was a student at the University of California, one of our leading schools, and then I went to graduate school to study the history and psychology of religion at another one of our very prestigious schools, the University of Chicago. And in all of these academic environments across America, Timothy Leary was a bad guy because he was saying that they were all phonies, and so that was my position up until the early 1990s. And then I began to look at the subject in a kind of different way. When I began to realize, I always had a foot in. I was very interested in mystical phenomenology and the religious experience and meditation and these different techniques and modalities for therapy and transformation. But I was also interested in the larger macro questions of political and social and global transformation. And I began to appreciate what Tim was doing. And that's also when I began to become more aware of what the CIA had begun to do in America in the 1950s, in the mind control project of MKUltra. So that was around the time that I decided to study more and understand Tim more. And then that's when I decided to do this book on him, his memorial volume, which in America is titled Outside Looking In. And just give another point of view on Timothy Leary, to try to put the madness of his method in some kind of context so we can understand. He wasn't just telling people to take drugs. He was telling people to question authority, to drop out of mainstream society because it was non-democratic, and think for yourselves.
And for how long did you work on this book?
Oh, that book I worked on for I don't know, 3 or 4 years. Yeah, I just contacted a lot of people who knew Tim intimately and could articulate, what he was about, and I got to know Tim even better during this period. Lived at his house and spent a lot of time with him, and it was really worthwhile time for me. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yes, does Timothy Leary really works on himself through psychedelic, or he just making what you're saying, the PR and fight for freedom? Does he did personal work, spiritual development? How do you see that?
Well, that's a really hard and question. Tim was a very, very complicated man, and I tried to understand him the best I could, and I can just tell stories, like he was very mercurial. There were some times you could be with Timothy Leary, and he would, like when I first met him, he just seemed like a burned out, old, kind of angry, egotistical guy. And there have been other times when I've been with Timothy Leary when he has appeared like he was the most illuminated, compassionate, wizened Zen master. And this quality of his presence and the way he would listen to you and interact. He was a master. He was Tim, before he even got into psychedelic drugs, had developed systems of personality assessment and analysis of psychotherapy and group process, and he had a real gift. He had a real gift of his mind was brilliant, and it was a little fractured too. And so look at what he did. He wrote a book. His first book he ever wrote was voted the Book of the Year in American Psychology in 1959. And then he got interested in psychedelics, and in just a couple years, he orchestrated this massive research project where, I think 3,000 people or some very large number of people were turned on. The most extraordinary people in the culture. Captains of business and arts and scholars and religion, all fields. And how many books did he write during that period? And journal articles. And then he grew up as a Roman Catholic and with a very uptight mother and a brutal father that abandoned him as a young boy. And so religion was just bullshit to him. And then he began to have these mystical experiences and traveled in India, studied that whole Eastern approach thoroughly with people like Lama Govinda and so, your question, did he transform himself? Well, there are some passages in my book. I'm thinking of one in the interview with Houston Smith, who is a very wise man, where he and Tim were very close and their lives kind of went in and out of orbit. And, just to comment, do people ever really change? I don't know. That's been said about Ram Dass too. People that knew him when he was Richard Alpert and then didn't see him for 20 years after he went through all the psychedelic stuff. And this was a psychologist talking, and he said after seeing him, he goes, Dick, you haven't changed a bit. And so, Tim was part madman and part prophet. And he was always an extraordinarily, precocious, controversial person, even when he was 13 years old. So